Sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in what looks like nothing at all. 8-year-old Nali learned this when her white grandfather died and left her a falling-down cabin and a half-dead dog in the Arizona desert. Everyone said she got cheated. The townspeople laughed and called it junk, but Nali named the skinny dog Ghost and made that broken place home. She knew the land held secrets if you listened close enough. One hot day, Ghost started digging under the old porch. What he found changed everything. A rusty box full of maps and papers that led to gold worth $200 million. But how does a little Apache girl claim a fortune when the whole world thinks she doesn't matter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory in 1887 was a place where dreams came to die under the relentless sun. Red dust settled on everything: wooden storefronts, wagon wheels, and the hopes of folks who'd traveled too far west with too little sense. The town of Copper Ridge sat like a scab on the desert floor, 43 buildings, and a church that hadn't seen a proper preacher in 2 years. Nali had arrived 3 days after the funeral, riding in the back of a supply wagon with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter from a lawyer she'd never met. The inheritance papers crinkled in her small hands as she stood before the cabin that was now supposedly hers. The structure leaned to one side, like an old man favoring a bad hip, its roof missing shingles and its porch sagging under the weight of abandonment. The dog lay dying in the shade of that broken porch. She'd seen plenty of death in her 8 years. Apache children learned early that life was fragile, that survival required constant attention to the world around you. But something about this particular dog's suffering called to her in a way she couldn't explain. His ribs showed through matted, brown fur, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed too bright for such a broken body. "That mutt ain't worth the bullet to put him down," said Edgar Thornton, the lawyer who'd brought her here. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles every few seconds. "Your grandfather was peculiar about that dog, wouldn't let anyone near it even when it was clear the animal was suffering." Nali knelt beside the dog, noting how his ears perked slightly at her approach. She'd learned to read animals from her grandmother, who'd taught her that creatures often knew things people had forgotten. This dog's eyes held secrets. "What's his name?" she asked. Thornton shuffled through his papers. "Don't rightly know." "Your grandfather just called him the dog. Lived here 5 years, and far as anyone knew, that animal was his only companion." The cabin's interior told the story of a man who'd lived deliberately small. One room served as kitchen, bedroom, and sitting area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel displaying 3 objects: a photograph of a young Apache woman who might have been Nali's grandmother, a silver pocket watch, and a leather collar that looked too good for the dying dog outside. Nali picked up the collar, running her fingers over the worn leather. Burned into the material was a single word: "Ghost, ghost," she whispered, and the dog outside whined softly in response. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Now, Miss Nali, I've got to be honest with you. This inheritance, it ain't much. The cabin needs work, the land's mostly worthless desert, and maintaining that dog will cost money you don't have. The town council's already discussed options. And for your care," Nali had heard this conversation before, in different words from different white officials. They always spoke about Apache children as problems to be solved, rather than people to be respected. She'd lived in 3 different mission schools and 2 foster homes since her parents died, and each placement had begun with similar conversations about practical considerations and limited options. But something felt different here. The cabin might be broken, but it belonged to her legally. The papers said so. The dog might be dying, but he'd responded to his name when she'd spoken it. And the land, which everyone dismissed as worthless, hummed with a presence she recognized from childhood stories. "I'll stay," she said simply. Thornton's spectacles nearly slipped off his nose. "Child, you don't understand. This is wilderness. You're 8 years old. There's no school, no neighbors close enough to help if something happens. The nearest water source is a quarter-mile walk, and winter in this desert gets colder than you might expect. Nali walked to the window and looked out at the endless expanse of red rock and scrub brush. In the distance, mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks touched by clouds that promised rain, but rarely delivered. She'd grown up in this landscape before the government schools. Her grandmother had taught her to find water in the desert, to read weather in the behavior of birds, to understand which plants could heal and which could kill. "I'll stay," she repeated. The lawyer spent another hour trying to convince her otherwise, but Nali had inherited more than a cabin and a dying dog. From her Apache grandmother, she'd inherited a stubbornness that could outlast winter storms. From her white grandfather, a man she'd never met but was beginning to understand, she'd apparently inherited the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most valuable things came disguised as nothing at all. After Thornton left, muttering about impossible children and legal complications, Nali carried a tin cup of precious water to the dog on the porch. Ghost lifted his head with considerable effort and drank carefully, his tail offering the faintest suggestion of a wag. "Well, Ghost," she said, settling beside him in the shade. "Looks like it's just you and me now." The dog's response was to rest his muzzle on her leg, as if he'd been waiting 8 years for exactly this moment. Over the next few days, Nali established routines that would keep them both alive. The cabin came with basic supplies: flour, beans, a side of bacon wrapped in canvas, and a small store of canned goods. A well behind the cabin provided clean water, though it required considerable cranking to bring it up from the depths. The fireplace drew properly, and there was enough split wood stacked against the back wall to last several weeks. Ghost improved slowly under her care. She fed him small portions of bacon fat mixed with water, gradually adding bits of meat as his stomach could handle it. His coat began to show hints of its original russet color, and those intelligent eyes grew brighter each day. The townspeople of Copper Ridge watched her situation with the mixture of curiosity and disapproval that small communities reserved for anything unusual. Mrs. Adelaide Cromwell, who ran the general store, made a point of telling everyone who'd listen that it ain't natural for a child to be living alone like that. Sheriff Bill Hastings stopped by twice in the first week, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but really to satisfy his own curiosity about what an 8-year-old Apache girl might do with inherited property. "You sure you're managing all right?" "Out here?" he asked on his second visit, his eyes taking inventory of the cabin's modest improvements. Nali had spent 2 days patching the worst holes in the roof with tin cans and tar, and she'd managed to stabilize the porch supports with rocks and wooden braces. "Yes, sir," she replied, the same answer she'd given every adult who'd questioned her capabilities throughout her short life. Sheriff Hastings was a decent man as white lawmen went, but he carried the burden of conventional thinking. "Winter's coming in a few months. Gets cold out here. That cabin might not keep you warm enough." Nali had already identified the cabin's weaknesses and begun planning solutions. The chinks between logs needed fresh mortar, which she could make from clay and grass. The windows required better coverings, which she could fashion from canvas and wooden frames. The fireplace needed a more efficient design for heating, which her grandmother had taught her to build using strategic stone placement. "I'll manage," she said. What she didn't tell Sheriff Hastings was that Ghost had begun displaying behaviors that suggested the dog knew things about the property that no one else did. He'd taken to sitting in specific spots around the cabin, staring intently at the ground as if listening to sounds only he could hear. He showed particular interest in the area beneath the front porch, pawing at the dirt with a persistence that seemed purposeful rather than random. Nali had learned to pay attention when animals acted deliberately. Her grandmother used to say that creatures lived closer to the earth's secrets than people did, and that wisdom meant watching when they tried to share those secrets. On her 7th evening in the cabin, as she sat by the fireplace mending a tear. In her dress, Ghost rose from his usual spot by the door and walked purposefully to the window facing east. He sat perfectly still, ears pricked forward, body tense with attention. Nali joined him at the window, but saw nothing unusual in the darkness beyond. The desert night was crisp and clear, stars scattered across the sky like scattered salt. But Ghost remained alert, as if expecting something important to happen. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Ghost looked at her with those knowing eyes, then back out the window. In that moment, Nali understood that her inheritance included more than a cabin and a dog. She'd inherited a mystery that her grandfather had left specifically for her to solve. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with the kind of anticipation she remembered from childhood stories about hidden treasures and ancient wisdom. Her grandmother had always said that the most important gifts were never obvious, that they required patience and wisdom to recognize. As if responding to her thoughts, Ghost walked to the cabin door and looked back at her expectantly. When she opened it, he trotted directly to the front porch and began digging in the exact spot he'd been favoring for days. Nali fetched the rusty shovel she'd found leaning against the cabin's back wall. By lamplight, she began helping Ghost dig in the hard-packed earth beneath the porch. 3 feet down, her shovel struck something metallic. Her heart hammered as she cleared away more dirt, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a metal box, about the size of a large book. Ghost's tail wagged with unmistakable satisfaction as they worked together to unearth their discovery. The box was heavier than expected and secured with a simple clasp that had rusted but still functioned. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were papers, lots of them. Maps drawn in careful ink, official-looking documents with seals and signatures, and pages covered in her grandfather's handwriting. Nali couldn't read all the words, but she recognized enough to understand that these papers were important. The map showed the local area in far more detail than any she'd seen, with X marks and notations scattered across the landscape. The official documents bore the words mining claim and territorial survey. At the bottom of the box, wrapped separately, was a photograph of her grandfather standing beside a much younger Ghost. Both looked directly at the camera with expressions of quiet determination. On the back, someone had written, "For Nali when she's ready." As she sat on the porch floor surrounded by mysterious papers with Ghost pressed warm against her side, Nali understood that her real inheritance was just beginning to reveal itself. The morning after the discovery, Nali woke to find Ghost sitting by the metal box, as if he'd been guarding it through the night. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the still air. She'd barely slept, her mind spinning with questions about the papers she'd found. The maps were the most intriguing items in the box. They showed her property and the surrounding area, but with details that didn't appear on any territorial survey. She'd seen creeks were marked where she saw only dry arroyos. Elevation markers indicated hills where the land appeared flat. Most puzzling were the symbols scattered across the drawings. Small triangles, circles, and squares, with notations in multiple handwritings. Nali spread the largest map across the cabin's small table, weighing down the corners with stones she'd collected from the yard. Ghost immediately came to her side, placing one paw on the map as if pointing to a specific location. His claw rested on a circled area about a quarter-mile north of the cabin, marked with the symbol of a triangle inside. "A square. You know something about this, don't you, boy?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. The official documents were harder to decipher, filled with legal language that swam before her eyes. She could make out important words like claim, mineral rights, and territorial authority, but the full meaning remained elusive. What struck her most was the sheer number of papers, dozens of documents with official seals and formal signatures. Her grandfather's handwritten notes proved most accessible. His penmanship was careful and clear, as if he'd intended someone to read these words after his death. Some pages contained what appeared to be daily observations about weather, wildlife, and geological features. Others held more cryptic entries that read like codes or riddles. One page, dated just 3 months before his death, caught her attention. "The girl will come soon. Ghost knows. The land will speak to her as it spoke to her grandmother." What we hid must be found before winter, before they realize what she's inherited. The triangle marks the beginning. Remember, trust no one but the earth itself. A chill ran down Nali's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Her grandfather had known she was coming. Somehow, he'd planned this entire inheritance, specifically for her. The sound of approaching horses broke her concentration. Ghost's head snapped up, ears alert, and he moved to the window with the purposeful tension she'd learned to recognize. 3 riders were approaching from the direction of town, dust trailing behind their horses like a warning flag. Nali quickly gathered the papers and returned them to the metal box, which she slid under her bed. She'd learned in the mission schools that valuable things disappeared when the wrong people noticed them. The visitors turned out to be Sheriff Hastings, accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize. One was dressed like a businessman, with a pressed suit and polished boots that seemed ridiculous for desert travel. The other wore working clothes, but carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Morning, Nali," Sheriff Hastings called as he dismounted. "These gentlemen wanted to meet you. They've got some questions about your property." The businessman stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal thinning hair, slicked back with pomade. "Miss Nali, I'm Clarence Whitman from the Territorial Land Office. This is Jake Morrison, who represents certain mining interests in the region." Morrison, the man in working clothes, studied the cabin and surrounding land with calculating eyes. He was the type of man Nali had learned to distrust on sight. Someone who looked at everything in terms of what it might be worth to him. "We understand you've inherited this property from your grandfather," Whitman continued, consulting a leather folder. "We're here to help you understand your options." "Options?" Nali asked, though she suspected she knew where this conversation was heading. "Well, you see, child, this land isn't really suitable for a young girl to manage alone," Morrison said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone adults used when they wanted to steal something from someone too young to stop them. "Harsh climate, isolation, no real resources to speak of. But there are folks who might be willing to take it off your hands for a fair price." Ghost had positioned himself between Nali and the visitors, his body tense and ready. She rested one hand on his head, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "The property isn't for sale," she said quietly. Whitman consulted his papers again. "Miss, with respect, you're 8 years old. You don't understand the complexities of land ownership. In the territory, there are taxes, maintenance requirements, legal obligations. Without proper adult supervision—" "I have adult supervision," Nali interrupted. "Sheriff Hastings checks on me regular." Sheriff Hastings shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Nali, these gentlemen make some valid points. Maybe you should hear them out." Morrison stepped closer, and Ghost's low growl warned him to maintain his distance. "Look, girl, we're trying to help you here. This land's got no water rights, no mineral potential, nothing but rocks and rattlesnakes. But I might be willing to offer you $50 for the whole spread. That's more money than most Apache children see in a lifetime." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Nali felt anger rise in her chest, but her grandmother's training held her back from responding immediately. Smart people gathered information before they acted. "What makes you think there's no mineral potential?" she asked. Morrison and Whitman exchanged a quick glance that didn't escape her notice. "Well, it's been surveyed, of course," Morrison said. "Territory's got records of all the geological assessments." "Could I see those records?" Another glance passed between the men. "They're technical documents," Whitman said. "Nothing a child would understand." Nali nodded as if accepting his explanation, but her mind filed away the information that these men were lying about something. The papers hidden under her bed suggested that her grandfather had conducted his own geological assessments, and they painted a very different picture of the land's potential. "I appreciate your offer," she said carefully, "but I'm not ready to sell. This was my grandfather's home. I'd like to understand why he chose to live here before I make any decisions." Morrison's face darkened. "You can't eat sentiment, girl. Winter's coming, and you'll find out real quick how hard life gets out here. My offer might not stand much longer." "That sounds like a threat," Sheriff Hastings said mildly, but his hand rested on his gun belt. "Just practical advice," Morrison replied, though his eyes held promise of future trouble. After the men left, Nali retrieved the metal box and studied the papers with new urgency. If Morrison and Whitman were so eager to buy supposedly worthless land, there had to be something here they wanted. The question was what? She spent the rest of the day comparing her grandfather's maps to the actual landscape, using Ghost as her guide. The dog seemed to understand the purpose of their expedition, leading her confidently to specific locations marked on the drawings. The first marked spot revealed nothing obvious, just a pile of rocks that might have been natural or might have been arranged by human hands. But when she climbed on top of the pile and looked back toward the cabin, she realized it provided a perfect view of anyone approaching from 3 different directions. A lookout post. The second location proved more interesting. Hidden in a natural depression behind a stand of mesquite trees, she found evidence of old digging, holes that had been carefully filled and disguised, but which Ghost's nose easily detected. By evening, Nali had visited 6 marked locations and begun to understand that her grandfather had been conducting some kind of systematic search of the property. The maps weren't just drawings, they were records of an investigation that had taken years to complete. As she prepared a simple dinner of beans and bacon, she reflected on the day's discoveries. Morrison and Whitman's visit hadn't been coincidental. They knew something about this land that they didn't want her to discover. Her grandfather's notes suggested he'd been hiding something valuable, and the urgency in his final entries implied that time was running out. Ghost lay by the fireplace, content after their day of exploration, but alert to any sounds from outside. Nali had noticed that he never fully relaxed anymore, as if he understood that their discovery had put them both in danger. She opened the metal box one more time before bed, studying her grandfather's photograph by lamplight. In the picture, he looked determined but worried, like a man carrying the weight of important secrets. Ghost, younger and stronger in the photograph, stood beside him with the same alert expression he wore now. "What did you two find out here?" she whispered to the photograph. As if responding to her question, Ghost rose and walked to the window. Outside, barely visible in the moonlight, a rider sat motionless on the ridge overlooking the cabin. Watching, waiting, Nali blew out the lamp and crept to the window beside Ghost. The rider remained perfectly still for several minutes, then turned his horse and disappeared into the darkness. Someone was definitely interested in her property, and it wasn't just for the $50 Morrison had offered. Whatever her grandfather had hidden here was worth enough to justify surveillance, pressure, and probably worse if she didn't handle the situation carefully. She slept that night with Ghost pressed against her side and the metal box under her pillow, understanding for the first time that her inheritance included not just land and secrets, but genuine danger. Nali woke before dawn, with a plan forming in her mind, like morning mist gathering in desert hollows. The night's surveillance had convinced her that simply hiding the papers wouldn't be enough. She needed to understand what her grandfather had discovered before someone decided to take it from her by force. Ghost stirred as she carefully extracted the metal box from beneath her pillow. In the pre-dawn darkness, she spread the papers across the floor, organizing them by type. Maps in one pile, official documents in another, and her grandfather's handwritten notes in a third. What emerged was a pattern she'd missed in yesterday's hasty examination. The surveyor's map, the most detailed of the drawings, showed not just geographical features but temporal markers. Some areas were marked with dates going back 5 years, others with recent notations from just months before her grandfather's death. The symbols she'd initially dismissed as random marks now revealed themselves as a systematic cataloging system. Triangles marked areas where her grandfather had found evidence of previous mining activity. Circles indicated natural geological formations that suggested mineral deposits. Squares marked locations where he'd discovered something worth hiding, and in 3 places he'd drawn stars with careful dates beside them. Nali traced the star symbols with her finger, noting that they formed a rough triangle encompassing her entire property. 2 were marked with dates from 3 years ago. The third bore a date from just 2 months before his death, accompanied by a note in careful handwriting. Final confirmation. The main vein runs directly beneath the cabin foundation. God help the child when she discovers what I've left her. Ghost padded to the door and whined softly, his signal that he needed to go outside, but instead of heading to his usual spot behind the cabin, he trotted purposefully toward the area marked with the most recent star symbol. Nali grabbed her grandfather's map and followed. The marked location sat about 200 yards northeast of the cabin, where a natural outcropping of red rock created a small canyon. Ghost led her directly to a section of the rock face that looked identical to every other section, then sat and looked at her expectantly. "Show me, boy," she whispered. Ghost began pawing at the base of the rock wall, and Nali knelt to examine the area more closely. What she'd initially taken for natural cracks in the stone revealed themselves as carefully mortared joints. Someone had built a false rock wall that blended perfectly with the natural formation. Using a sturdy stick, she pried at the mortar until one of the false stones shifted. Behind it lay a cavity containing another oiled cloth bundle. This one held items different from the papers in the buried box, actual mining tools scaled down to manageable sizes, detailed geological samples labeled with locations and dates, and most shocking of all, 3 small leather pouches containing gold dust and tiny nuggets. Nali's hands trembled as she examined the gold. She'd heard enough stories to know real gold when she saw it, and these samples represented more wealth than most families in Copper Ridge earned in a year. But according to her grandfather's notes, this was just evidence of what lay beneath the surface. A sound made both her and Ghost freeze, hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Nali quickly rewrapped the mining tools and gold samples, returning them to their hiding place and repositioning the false stone. She and Ghost made it back to the cabin just as Sheriff Hastings came into view, riding alone this time. "Morning, Nali," he called, dismounting near the porch. "Thought I'd check on you after yesterday's visit. Those men didn't upset you, did they?" Nali studied his face, trying to read whether this was genuine concern or something else. Sheriff Hastings had always been fair with her, but yesterday's introduction of Morrison and Whitman made her cautious about trusting anyone. "They made an offer on the property," she said carefully. "I told them I wasn't interested in selling." Hastings nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Nali, I've got to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Have you found anything unusual on this property? Anything that might explain why those men are so interested in buying land that everybody knows is worthless?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She'd prepared to deflect casual inquiries, but Hastings was asking her straight out if she'd discovered something valuable. "Why do you ask?" she countered. "Because Morrison came back to town yesterday asking a lot of specific questions about your grandfather. Wanted to know if he'd ever filed any mining claims, if anyone had seen him digging around the property, if he'd ever shown any samples to folks in town." Hastings paused, studying her face. "And because I remember your grandfather, Nali, he wasn't the type of man to live in isolation unless he had a good reason." Nali felt the weight of decision pressing on her shoulders. Sheriff Hastings was probably trustworthy, but her grandfather's final note had been clear. Trust no one but the earth itself. On the other hand, she was 8 years old, facing grown men who wanted something valuable enough to justify surveillance and pressure. She needed allies. "Sheriff," she said slowly, "if I had found something and if there were people who wanted to take it from me, what would be the legal way to protect it?" Hastings' eyes sharpened. "That depends on what you found. But generally speaking, anything discovered on your own property belongs to you, provided you can prove ownership and provided it doesn't violate any existing territorial claims." He paused. "Why don't you show me what you've got, and I'll help you figure out the best way to handle it." Ghost, who had been lying peacefully on the porch, suddenly raised his head and growled low in his throat. A moment later, Nali heard what had alerted him: more horses approaching and moving fast. 3 riders crested the ridge at a gallop, kicking up clouds of dust in their haste. As they drew closer, Nali recognized Morrison from yesterday, accompanied by 2 men she'd never seen before. All 3 were armed, and their approach suggested urgency rather than a social call. "Hastings!" Morrison shouted as he reined in his horse, hard enough to make the animal rear. "We need to talk to the girl right now." Sheriff Hastings stepped between Morrison and the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Easy there, Morrison. What's got you so stirred up?" "Someone's been asking questions in Phoenix about geological surveys in this area," Morrison said, breathing hard from the ride. "Official questions from territorial administrators. Questions that suggest someone's found something worth investigating." Nali felt her heart sink. Somehow, word of the discovery had leaked beyond Copper Ridge. Her grandfather's fears about timing were proving prophetic. "I don't see how that concerns us," Hastings said mildly. One of Morrison's companions, a man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, leaned forward in his saddle. "It concerns us because if there's mineral wealth on this property, certain parties have prior claim to it." "What kind of prior claim?" Hastings asked. "The kind backed up by territorial statute and federal law," Morrison replied. "This land was surveyed 3 years ago under a mineral rights assessment program. Any discoveries fall under the jurisdiction of the Territorial Mining Authority." Nali had never heard of the Territorial Mining Authority, but something about Morrison's explanation didn't ring true. Her grandfather's papers included territorial documents, and none of them mentioned any such organization. "I'd like to see the documentation for that claim," Sheriff Hastings said. Morrison's scarred companion smiled without warmth. "You'll see it when we file our official report. Right now, we need to conduct a property inspection to determine if any territorial statutes have been violated." "Not without a warrant, you don't," Hastings replied firmly. The 3 men exchanged glances, and Nali caught the subtle signals passing between them. They'd hoped to intimidate her into compliance, but Sheriff Hastings's presence had complicated their plans. "This isn't over," Morrison said finally. "The girl's got no business holding property that rightfully belongs to the territory. We'll be back with proper documentation." As the men rode away, Sheriff Hastings turned to Nali with an expression of grim concern. "Child, I think you'd better show me exactly what your grandfather left you, because whatever it is, it's valuable enough to bring out some very dangerous people." The decision to trust Sheriff Hastings felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once she jumped, there would be no going back. But Morrison's return with armed companions had made one thing clear. She couldn't face this alone. Nali led Hastings inside the cabin and retrieved the metal box from its hiding place. As she spread the papers across the table, she watched his face change from curiosity to amazement to deep concern. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, examining the geological samples and mining claims. "Your grandfather was sitting on a fortune." "How much of a fortune?" Nali asked. Hastings studied the maps and official documents with the careful attention of a man who understood their implications. "If these surveys are accurate, and if the gold deposits extend as far as your grandfather believed, this could be one of the richest claims in the territory, maybe worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." The number was so large, it barely registered in Nali's mind. She'd grown up in a world where a dollar was significant money, where most families counted wealth in terms of livestock and stored food. rather than cash. But there's something else here, Hastings continued, pulling out a document she hadn't examined closely. This isn't just a mining claim. It's a journal entry dated 6 months ago. He read aloud in a voice heavy with implication. Today, I discovered the truth about the Morrison Consortium. They've been using forged territorial documents to steal mineral rights from legitimate claim holders. 3 families have been murdered for their land in the past 2 years, their deaths made to look like accidents or Indian raids. The territorial governor is either involved or being paid to look the other way. I must hide the evidence and pray that Nali will be smart enough to use it wisely. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Nali sank into her grandfather's chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd inherited, not just gold, but evidence of murder and corruption involving some of the most powerful men in the territory. Your grandfather wasn't just a prospector, Hastings said quietly. He was building a case against a criminal conspiracy, and now they know you have his evidence. Ghost, who had been lying quietly by the door, suddenly stood and moved to the window. His low growl warned them that someone was approaching again, but this time he seemed more alert than alarmed. A single rider was coming up the path, an elderly Apache man mounted on a paint horse. He rode with the straight-backed dignity of someone accustomed to being respected, and Ghost's tail wagged tentatively as he drew closer. "You know him?" Hastings asked. Nali studied the approaching figure, something familiar in his bearing triggering half-forgotten memories. As he dismounted and walked toward the cabin, she recognized the deliberate grace of movement that marked tribal elders. "I am Joseph Running Bear," the man said in carefully accented English. "I knew your grandmother, child, and I knew the white man who lived here." Nali opened the door, and Ghost immediately trotted out to greet the visitor, pressing against his legs with obvious affection. Running Bear scratched the dog's ears while studying Nali with eyes that seemed to see everything. "Your grandfather asked me to watch over you when you came," he said. "He said you would inherit more than land, and that there would be men who wanted to steal it from you." "How did you know my grandfather?" Hastings asked. Running Bear's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "White man asks many questions. Better to listen first." He turned to Nali. "Your grandfather was not like other white men. He came to our camp 3 years ago, sick with guilt about something he had done. He brought gifts and asked to speak with the elders about making amends." "What kind of amends?" Nali asked. He had been part of a group that was stealing land from Apache families. They used fake government papers to claim our hunting grounds, then sold the rights to mining companies. Your grandfather said he could not live with the weight of his actions. The pieces began falling into place in Nali's mind. Her grandfather hadn't just discovered the conspiracy, he'd been part of it initially, then developed a conscience that put him in mortal danger. "He spent 2 years gathering evidence against the men he had worked with," Running Bear continued. "He said the only way to balance the scales was to make sure they faced justice for their crimes. And now they want the evidence," Hastings said. Grimly, Running Bear nodded. "But they also want the gold. Your grandfather found more than he told anyone. Enough to buy justice if it's used correctly." "What do you mean?" Nali asked. "Come," Running Bear said. "I will show you something your grandfather asked me to keep safe." He led them behind the cabin to an area where Ghost had never shown any interest. Using a stick, Running Bear traced a pattern in the dirt, a series of symbols that meant nothing to Hastings, but which Nali recognized from childhood stories. Apache trail markers indicating a hidden cache, your grandfather learned. "Our ways during the time he spent seeking forgiveness," Running Bear explained. "He asked me to teach him how to hide things, so they would never be found by white men, but could be discovered by someone who understood the old knowledge. He guided them to a seemingly random cluster of rocks, then showed them how specific. Stones had been arranged to point toward a large boulder. Behind the boulder, concealed by careful placement of smaller rocks and desert plants, was another hidden cavity. This cache contained items that made Nali's earlier discoveries look modest. Leather pouches heavy with gold nuggets, carefully wrapped bars of refined gold, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal that appeared to be a complete record of the conspiracy her grandfather had uncovered. Your grandfather said the gold was enough to hire lawyers, buy protection, and make sure the evidence reached people who could act on it, Running Bear said. But he also said it was enough to make you a target for the rest of your life if you handled it wrong. Hastings whistled low as he examined the gold bars. This has got to be worth $50,000 or more, maybe a lot more. The journal is worth more than the gold, Running Bear said. It contains names, dates, locations, evidence of murders made to look like accidents, records of bribes paid to territorial officials, everything needed to destroy the men who have been stealing. Apache land. Nali felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Her grandfather had left her not just wealth, but the power to bring justice to families who had suffered under the conspiracy. The question was whether an 8-year-old Apache girl could survive long enough to use that power effectively. There's something else, Running Bear said, pulling out a folded paper from his shirt. Your grandfather wrote this letter for you. He said to give it to you when you found the gold. Nali unfolded the letter with trembling hands. Her grandfather's careful handwriting filled the page. Dear Nali, if you are reading this, then you have proven yourself worthy of the trust I am placing in you. The gold is yours by right of inheritance, but the responsibility that comes with it is heavier than the metal itself. The men who killed your parents, yes, child, they were murdered, not killed in an accident as you were told, are the same men who will try to kill you if they discover what you now possess. Use the gold wisely. Trust Joseph Running Bear and Sheriff Hastings, but trust no one else until the guilty are brought to justice. The land remembers everything, and the spirits of those who were wronged demand that their stories be told. You are young, but you carry the wisdom of your grandmother and the determination of your Apache blood. Do not let them steal from you what they stole from so many others. The choice is yours, but know that I believe you are strong enough to see justice done. Your loving grandfather, Samuel Crawford. The revelation about her parents hit Nali like a physical blow. She'd been told they died in a riding accident, but she'd always wondered why their bodies were never recovered, why the circumstances had never quite made sense. I'm sorry, child, Running Bear said gently. Your grandfather wanted you to know the truth, but he also wanted you to be old enough to handle it. Hastings was studying the journal with growing alarm. This is evidence of at least 6 murders, maybe more, and it goes all the way up to the territorial capital. If this information is accurate, half the government is involved in the conspiracy. What do we do? Nali asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. We plan carefully, Running Bear said. Your grandfather spent 2 years gathering this evidence. We cannot let his sacrifice be wasted by acting too quickly, but we can't wait too long either, Hastings added. Morrison and his men will be back, probably with more people and better lies about their authority. We need to get this evidence to someone who can act on it before they decide to take what they want by force. Ghost had been listening to the conversation with the alert attention he'd shown since Nali's arrival. Now he walked to the edge of the clearing and looked back at them, as if suggesting they should leave this exposed location. The dog is right, Running Bear said. This place is too open, too easy to watch. Your grandfather prepared for this day. There are places where you can be safe while we decide how to proceed. Places? Nali asked. Hidden camps in the desert, known only to my people. Caves where water runs clean and food can be stored. Your grandfather helped prepare them, thinking you might need refuge when the truth came out. The idea of leaving. The cabin felt like abandoning her grandfather's memory, but the alternative, staying and fighting Morrison's men without preparation, seemed like suicide. How long would we need to hide? She asked. Until we can get the evidence to federal authorities in Phoenix, Hastings said. Maybe a week, maybe longer, depends on how quickly we can arrange protection and testimony. Nali looked around the cabin that had become home in such a short time. Ghost pressed against her legs, offering silent support for whatever decision she made. The weight of the gold and the responsibility it represented seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. "We'll go," she said finally. "But first, I want to bury the most important evidence in a place where only Ghost and I can find it. If something happens to us, at least the truth won't die with us." Running Bear smiled with approval. "Your grandmother would be proud. You think like a warrior, but you plan like a wise woman." As they began gathering the evidence and gold for transport, Nali felt the last of her childhood slipping away. She was no longer just an orphaned Apache girl trying to survive in the desert. She was the keeper of secrets that could change the fate of her people and bring justice to those who had died for their land. The transformation should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Her grandfather's faith in her felt like a sacred trust, and she intended to prove herself worthy of it. The hidden Apache camp lay 15 miles northeast of the cabin, tucked into a canyon so narrow that a person could walk past its entrance without noticing the gap in the rock walls. Running Bear led them there by paths that seemed to exist only in his memory, following ancient routes that avoided the main trails and left no tracks for Morrison's men to follow. Ghost trotted alongside Nali's horse with the easy confidence of an animal that had traveled these paths before. Every few miles, he would range ahead to scout the trail, returning with the all-clear signal that had become their routine. Nali realized her grandfather must have brought Ghost here during their planning sessions, preparing both dog and hiding place for the day when sanctuary would be needed. The camp itself was a marvel of hidden engineering. Fresh water emerged from a spring deep within the canyon, creating a small oasis surrounded by defensive positions that could be held by a few people against a much larger force. Natural caves provided shelter and storage, while the narrow entrance could be blocked with strategically placed boulders if enemies approached. "Your grandfather helped us improve this place," Running Bear explained as they settled their horses. "He understood that someday his people and mine might need to work together against common enemies." Sheriff Hastings examined the defensive positions with the eye of a man who'd seen military action. "Smart setup. Anyone trying to force their way in would be walking into a shooting gallery." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Nali said, though she suspected hope might not be enough. They spent the first day organizing the evidence and planning their approach to the territorial authorities. Running Bear had contacts among Apache, scouts who worked for the federal government, men who could be trusted to carry messages to Phoenix without alerting the corrupt territorial officials. The mining claims documentation proved even more damning than Nali had initially realized. Her grandfather's journal contained detailed records of how Morrison's consortium had operated, using forged federal documents to claim Apache hunting grounds, then selling mining rights to Eastern investors who believed they were buying legitimate territorial grants. "Look at this," Hastings said, studying one of the claim maps. "They've been running this scam for at least 5 years. Every major mining operation in this part of the territory is built on stolen land, and every Apache family forced off their traditional grounds lost their livelihood to these lies," Running Bear added quietly. Nali found herself studying the names in her grandfather's journal, both victims and perpetrators. Some of the Apache names were familiar from childhood stories her grandmother had told. Families who had simply vanished one day, their disappearances explained as voluntary relocations or conflicts with other tribes. "He documented everything," she murmured, reading through pages of careful observations. Dates, witnesses, locations where bodies were buried. One entry made her blood run cold. "Today, Morrison showed me the letter from the territorial governor authorizing the removal of hostile Apache families from the Copper Ridge area. The letter is backdated 6 months to make the murders look like lawful enforcement action. I must find a way to get this evidence to federal authorities before more families are killed." The letter in question was included in the evidence, its official territorial seal lending authenticity to what amounted to a death warrant for any Apache family that refused to abandon their ancestral lands. "This goes beyond theft," Hastings said after reading the governor's letter. "This is systematic genocide, backed by territorial law. Which is why your grandfather knew he could not trust local authorities," Running Bear said. "The corruption reaches to the highest levels of territorial government." As evening approached, Ghost began showing signs of restlessness, pacing the camp perimeter and occasionally growling at sounds only he could hear. His behavior had become their early warning system, and Nali had learned to trust his instincts. "Completely. Someone's coming," she said, recognizing the dog's alert posture. Running Bear moved to a concealed observation point overlooking the canyon entrance. After several minutes, he returned with troubling news. 6 riders, moving slowly, following our trail. "They're still several miles away, but they're tracking us." "How is that possible?" Hastings asked. "We were careful to avoid leaving tracks." "Professional trackers," Running Bear said grimly. "Morrison must have hired men with experience hunting Apache war parties." The realization that they'd been followed despite their precautions changed everything. The camp was defensible, but it could also become a trap if they were surrounded by superior numbers. "We need to split up," Nali said, surprising herself with the decisiveness of her words. "If they're tracking us to get the evidence, we can't let them catch all of it in one place." "Absolutely not," Hastings said. "You're 8 years old. You're not going anywhere alone." "She's right, though," Running Bear said thoughtfully. "If we divide the evidence and send it along different routes to Phoenix, at least some of it will reach the federal authorities, even if we're captured." Ghost padded over to Nali and sat beside her, his expression somehow conveying that he agreed with her assessment. The bond between them had grown stronger over the past weeks, and she'd begun to trust his judgment as much as her own. "Ghost and I know these canyons now," she said. "We can move faster than horses through the narrow places, and we know hiding spots they'd never find." "It's too dangerous," Hastings insisted. "Everything is dangerous now," Nali replied with a maturity that surprised all of them. "The question is whether we're going to let fear stop us from doing what's right." Running Bear studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your grandmother used to say that sometimes the spirits choose children to do the work that adults cannot accomplish. Perhaps this is such a time." They spent the next hour dividing the evidence into 3 packages. The original mining claims and property deeds went with Hastings, who would ride hard for Phoenix using the main trails. The most damaging evidence of murders and corruption went with Running Bear, who would use Apache trail networks to reach federal contacts in the territorial capital. Nali took the gold samples and her grandfather's personal journal, evidence that proved the financial scope of the conspiracy and provided the most detailed account of how the operation worked. "If something happens to Hastings and me," Running Bear said, "you take that evidence to Colonel James Mitchell at Fort Whipple. Your grandfather said Mitchell was one of the few federal officers who couldn't be bought." As they prepared to leave the camp by different routes, Ghost began exhibiting behavior Nali had never seen before. The dog moved to each of the adults in turn, pressing against their legs and looking up at them with what could only be described as a farewell gesture. "He knows we might not see each other again," she said softly. "Dogs understand more than we." "Give them credit for," Running Bear said. "Your grandfather chose his companion well." The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, still distant, but getting closer. Their trackers had found the entrance to the canyon and would be upon them within the hour. "Time to go," Hastings said, checking his rifle. "One final time." Nali shouldered the pack containing the evidence and checked the small pistol Running Bear had insisted she carry. Ghost took his position at her side, ready for whatever lay ahead. "Remember," Running Bear said, "you're not just carrying golden papers. You're carrying the hope of every family that's been destroyed by these men. Don't let that hope die with you." As they departed the camp by 3 different routes, Nali felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like armor. She was no longer running from danger. She was running toward justice, carrying the truth that could free her people from a cycle of theft and murder that had gone on too long. Behind them, the sound of pursuing horses grew louder, but ahead lay the possibility of redemption for all the wrongs that had been done in the name of progress and territorial expansion. 3 days into their journey toward Fort Whipple, Nali discovered that being hunted changed everything about how a person moved through the world. Every sound became a potential threat, every open space a possible trap, every stranger a source of danger. Ghost had adapted to their new reality with the instincts of an animal born to survive. But for Nali, the constant vigilance was exhausting. They traveled by night when possible, following deer trails and dry creek beds that offered concealment from anyone tracking them on horseback. During the day, they sheltered in caves or hidden overhangs, sleeping in shifts while one of them kept watch. Ghost had taken on the role of primary sentinel, his senses far more acute than Nali's for detecting approaching danger. On the third night, as they picked their way across a moonlit ridge, Ghost suddenly froze and dropped low to the ground. Nali immediately followed his lead, pressing herself flat against the rocky slope. In the distance, she could see what had alerted him, a campfire burning in the valley below, too large and too exposed to belong to anyone trying to avoid detection. Through her grandfather's old field glasses, she studied the camp and counted 5 men around the fire. Their horses were picketed nearby, and even at this distance she could see they were well armed. One of the figures looked familiar, the scarred man who had accompanied Morrison to the cabin. "They're not tracking us anymore," she whispered to Ghost. "They're waiting for us." The realization sent a chill down her spine. Somehow, Morrison's men had figured out their destination and moved to intercept them. Either they had inside information about federal contacts at Fort Whipple, or they'd simply reasoned that 3 groups of fugitives would eventually converge on the nearest federal installation. Ghost touched his nose to her hand, then began moving away from the ridge, in a direction that would take them around the valley rather than through it. His instincts had proven reliable so far, and Nali trusted his judgment completely. The detour added 2 days to their journey, but it also led them to an unexpected discovery. Following Ghost along what appeared to be a random animal trail, they came upon the remains of a small Apache settlement that had been destroyed recently. Burned buildings, scattered belongings, and 3 graves marked with traditional stones. Nali recognized the settlement from her grandfather's journal. This was one of the families that had voluntarily relocated, according to territorial records, but the evidence told a different story. Bullet holes scarred the remaining wooden structures, and the pattern of destruction suggested a deliberate attack rather than an accidental fire. In the ruins of what had been the main dwelling, she found something that made her blood run cold. A child's doll, half burned, but still recognizable. The family that had lived here had included children who were now dead or missing because of Morrison's conspiracy. Ghost whined softly and pawed at a disturbed section of ground near the graves. When Nali investigated, she found a small cache that the attackers had missed, traditional Apache items wrapped in oiled hide, including a bundle of letters written in careful English. The letters were correspondence between the settlement's elder and federal Indian agents, documenting the family's attempts to secure legal protection for their traditional lands. The most recent letter, dated just 2 months ago, explicitly requested federal investigation of threats made by territorial officials who claimed authority to remove hostile Indians from mineral-rich areas. They were trying to do everything legally, Nali said aloud, her voice heavy with the injustice of it all. They wrote to the government for help, and Morrison's people killed them before help could arrive. The discovery filled her with a rage that was both personal and tribal. These people had been her people, and their murder was part of the same conspiracy that had killed her parents and threatened her own life. The evidence she carried wasn't just about gold claims. It was about the systematic destruction of Apache families who stood in the way of territorial expansion. That night, as they sheltered in a hidden canyon, Nali read through her grandfather's journal again with new understanding. His guilt about participating in the conspiracy had been genuine, but his determination to expose it had been driven by more than conscience. He'd understood that unless someone stopped Morrison's operation, every Apache family in the territory would eventually face the same fate as the settlement they'd found. One journal entry, written just weeks before his death, revealed the full scope of his knowledge. "I now understand that the mining claims are only part of a larger plan. Morrison and his associates intend to clear all Apache families from a corridor running from Copper Ridge to the Colorado River. They have backing from Eastern investors who believe they're buying legitimately surveyed territorial land. The territorial governor receives a percentage of all sales, which explains his willingness to provide official documents for what amounts to ethnic cleansing. The partnership agreement that Running Bear had mentioned was included in the evidence, a formal document that divided the profits from stolen Apache lands among consortium members. What shocked Nali was the scale of the operation. Over 200,000 acres of traditional hunting grounds had been illegally claimed and sold to mining companies over the past 5 years. Ghost's sudden alertness broke her concentration. Someone was approaching their hiding place, moving carefully, but not carefully enough to escape the dog's notice. Nali quickly gathered the evidence and prepared to run, but Ghost's behavior suggested uncertainty rather than immediate danger. Low whistle echoed off the canyon walls, a signal she recognized from her childhood among Apache scouts. Someone was trying to communicate in a way that wouldn't alarm them. "Nali," came a whispered call in accented English. "Joseph Running Bear sent me." The voice belonged to a young Apache man who emerged from the shadows with his hands visible and empty. Ghost relaxed slightly but remained alert as the stranger approached. "I am Thomas Crow Feather," the man said. "Running Bear reached our scouts 2 days ago. He sent me to find you and guide you safely to Fort Whipple." "How do I know?" "You're telling the truth?" Nali asked. Though something about the man's bearing suggested honesty, Crow Feather pulled a familiar object from his shirt, Ghost's original collar, the one Nali had found in her grandfather's cabin. "Running Bear said to show you this. He said the dog would remember." Ghost immediately trotted to Crow Feather and allowed the man to scratch his ears, confirming that they had indeed met before. The reunion gave Nali the reassurance she needed. "Running Bear made it to Phoenix safely," Crow Feather reported. "His evidence reached federal authorities, and they're preparing arrest warrants for territorial officials. But Morrison's men have been hunting for you specifically. They know you have the financial records that could destroy their operation." "What about Sheriff Hastings?" Nali asked. Crow Feather's expression grew somber. "He reached Phoenix, but Morrison's people were waiting. There was a fight. Hastings is alive, but he's badly wounded and the evidence he carried was lost." The news hit Nali like a physical blow. Sheriff Hastings had risked his life to help her, and now he was paying the price for that loyalty. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders with renewed force. She was carrying the only remaining evidence that could complete the case against Morrison's conspiracy. "How much farther to Fort Whipple?" she asked. 2 days if we travel carefully, but Morrison has men watching all the approaches. Getting you inside will require a plan." As they prepared to move out, Ghost took his position at Nali's side with the loyal dedication that had never wavered throughout their ordeal. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, carrying the hopes of all the families who had died for their ancestral lands, and all the families who might yet be saved if justice could finally be served. The approach to Fort Whipple required crossing 15 miles of open desert, where a child and dog would be visible to anyone watching from the surrounding hills. Crow Feather had scouted the area for 2 days, confirming that Morrison's men had Established observation posts covering all the main approaches to the federal installation. We'll have to go in during the supply convoy, he explained as they sheltered in their final hiding place before the fort. Twice a week, civilian contractors bring supplies from Prescott. If you can get close enough to the wagons, you might be able to slip inside the fort with them. Nali studied the fort through her grandfather's field glasses, noting the layout and guard positions. Something about the situation felt wrong, though she couldn't identify exactly what was troubling her. How do you know so much about the fort's operations? She asked Crowfeather. I've been scouting for the army for 2 years, he replied. Colonel Mitchell uses Apache scouts to track hostile war parties and monitor territorial activities. Ghost, who had been resting quietly in the shade, suddenly lifted his head and looked directly at Crowfeather with an expression of intense concentration. The dog's behavior reminded Nali of how he acted when he sensed danger, but there was something different about his alertness this time. Ghost doesn't trust you, she said quietly. Crowfeather's face showed genuine surprise. The dog seemed to accept me when I showed him the collar. He accepted that you'd met before. That doesn't mean he trusts you now. As if responding to their conversation, Ghost moved to position himself between Nali and Crowfeather, his body language clearly protective. The dog had never shown this level of suspicion toward Running Bear or Sheriff Hastings, both of whom he'd accepted as allies from their first meeting. Maybe we should wait until tomorrow, Nali said, still trying to understand what was bothering her about the situation. We can't wait, Crowfeather replied, and something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. Morrison's men are closing in. This may be our only chance. The urgency in his voice felt forced, as if he were trying too hard to convince her. Combined with Ghost's suspicion, it triggered the survival instincts her grandmother had taught her to trust. I need to see something first, she said. Pulling her grandfather's journal from her pack, she flipped through the pages until she found the entry she was looking for, a detailed description of the Apache scouts her grandfather had worked with. During his investigation, Thomas Crowfeather was mentioned by name, but the description didn't match the man sitting across from her. According to my grandfather's notes, Thomas Crowfeather has a scar on his left hand from a knife fight 3 years ago, she said carefully. May I see your hands? The man who claimed to be Crowfeather hesitated for just a moment too long before extending his hands. Both were unmarked. Ghost's growl was low and dangerous, confirming what Nali had already begun to suspect. This man was not who he claimed to be. Who are you really? She asked, her hand moving instinctively toward the small pistol Running Bear had given her. The false Crowfeather's demeanor changed completely. The respectful manner disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation of a professional hunter. Smart girl, he said. Smarter than Morrison expected, but not smart enough to avoid walking into a trap. You're working for Morrison. I'm working. Oh, for myself, he corrected. Morrison's paying well for information about Apache scouts and their contacts with federal authorities. When Running Bear showed up asking for help, it was easy enough to volunteer for the job. The betrayal hit Nali like a physical blow. Running Bear had trusted this man, and that trust had put all of them in danger. Where's the real Thomas Crowfeather? She asked. Dead, along with the rest of his scout unit. Morrison's been systematically eliminating Apache contacts who might interfere with his operation. Your friend Running Bear walked into an ambush yesterday. He won't be providing any more evidence to federal authorities. The news about Running Bear's death filled Nali with grief and rage in equal measure. The kind elder who had helped her understand her inheritance had paid with his life for his loyalty to her grandfather's cause. What about Sheriff Hastings? She asked. Also dead. Morrison made sure of that personally. The false scout smiled without warmth. You're the last loose end, girl. The only person left who can connect Morrison to the murders and theft. Ghost's growl deepened, and Nali could see the dog's muscles tensing for action. Whatever happened next, she would have only one chance to escape. Why haven't you just killed me already? She asked, trying to buy time while she calculated distances and escape routes, because Morrison wants the evidence you're carrying. Specifically, he wants the partnership agreement and financial records that prove how the profits were divided. Without those documents, federal investigators might suspect conspiracy, but they can't prove the financial connections that would bring down the entire operation. And if I give you the evidence, then you die quickly instead of slowly. Morrison's not feeling particularly merciful toward the people who've caused him so much trouble. Nali's hand closed around the grip of her pistol, but she knew she'd never be fast enough to draw and fire before the false scout could reach her. Ghost, however, was coiled and ready to spring. "There's just one problem with your plan," she said. "What's that?" "You assumed I was stupid enough to carry all the evidence with me." The lie came easily, born of desperation and the survival instincts her grandmother had drilled into her. But it had the desired effect. The false scout's attention shifted. From immediate violence to interrogation. Where is it? Hidden back at the cabin, in a place Morrison's men will never find. The only way to get it is with Ghost's help. He's the only one who knows where my grandfather's final cache is located. It was a complete fabrication, but it played to the scout's greed and Morrison's need for the financial evidence. More importantly, it gave her the opening she needed. "Ghost," she said quietly. "Now." The dog launched himself at the false scout with the speed and power of a weapon designed for exactly this purpose, while the man struggled to defend himself against 60 pounds. A furious dog, Nali rolled away and drew her pistol. The confrontation lasted only seconds. Ghost's attack gave Nali the time she needed to get clear, and her first shot took the false scout in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own weapon flying into the rocks. "Call off the dog!" he screamed, trying to protect his throat. From Ghost's snapping jaws. "Ghost, hold," Nali commanded, and the dog immediately backed off, but remained ready to attack again. Blood flowed from multiple bite wounds on the false scout's arms and shoulders, but he was still conscious and able to talk. Nali kept her pistol trained on him, while she considered her options. "How many men does Morrison have watching the fort?" she asked. "Go to hell!" Ghost's warning growl convinced the wounded man to reconsider his defiance. 6 men, he said quickly. 2 on the north approach, 2 on the south, and 2 covering the main road from Prescott. "What about inside the fort? Does Morrison have people there too?" The false scout's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. Morrison's corruption extended into the federal military, which explained how they'd been able to anticipate her movements and set traps at every turn. "Who?" she demanded. "Lieutenant Parker in the quartermaster's office. He reports supply convoy schedules and visitor information." The revelation that Morrison had corrupted federal officers changed everything about Nali's situation. She couldn't simply walk into Fort Whipple and expect protection. She'd be walking into another trap. Is Colonel Mitchell part of the conspiracy? No. But Parker makes sure that anyone carrying evidence against Morrison never gets to see the colonel. Nali felt the walls closing in around her. Running Bear was dead, Sheriff Hastings was dead, and the one place she'd hoped to find safety was compromised. She was truly alone now, except for Ghost. But as she looked at her loyal companion, an idea began forming in her mind. Her grandfather hadn't just left her evidence. He'd left her a partner who knew things that even Morrison's corrupt network couldn't anticipate. "Ghost," she said quietly. "We're going to finish what Grandfather started, but we're going to do it our way." With the false scout securely tied and hidden in their canyon shelter, Nali faced the most important decision of her young life. Every adult who had tried to help her was dead or compromised, and Morrison's network of corruption reached farther than anyone had suspected. The logical choice would be to run, to take Ghost and disappear into the deep desert where they could survive until the danger passed. But logic didn't account for the faces of the Apache families who had died for their land, or the children, whose dolls lay scattered in burned settlements, or the weight of her grandfather's final trust. Running would keep her alive, but it would also ensure that Morrison's conspiracy continued claiming victims. "What do you think, Ghost?" she asked. studying her grandfather's journal by moonlight. "Are we brave enough to take on the whole territorial government?" Ghost's response was to rest his muzzle on the journal, as if indicating that the answers lay in her grandfather's careful documentation. And perhaps they did. Samuel Crawford had spent 2 years gathering evidence not just of crimes, but of the methods Morrison used to commit them. Understanding those methods might provide the key to defeating them. The journal revealed that Morrison's power came from 3 sources: corrupt territorial officials who provided legal cover, intimidation tactics that silenced potential witnesses, and control of information flow that prevented evidence from reaching honest federal authorities. But it also revealed weaknesses in the conspiracy that a careful opponent might exploit. Morrison's need for official documentation meant that every illegal land grab left a paper trail. His reliance on intimidation meant that he had to operate openly enough to frighten potential opposition, and his control of information required a network of corrupt contacts who might be turned against him if approached correctly. Most importantly, her grandfather had identified one person in the territorial capital who remained above Morrison's influence: Federal Judge William Harrison, who had jurisdiction over crimes involving federal land and Indian affairs. Harrison was known for his incorruptible character and his protection of constitutional rights, even when those rights belonged to people the territorial government considered inconvenient. "If we can get the evidence to Judge Harrison," Nali murmured, "he has the authority to issue federal arrest warrants that the territorial government can't ignore." But Phoenix was over 100 miles away, and Morrison's men would be watching every route between Fort Whipple and the territorial capital. Getting there alive would require not just courage, but strategic thinking that could outmaneuver experienced killers. Ghost's sudden alertness interrupted her planning. In the distance, she could hear the sound of multiple horses moving fast. Across the desert floor, Morrison's men had discovered that their scout was missing and were conducting a systematic search of the area. "Time to go," she whispered, gathering the evidence and checking her supplies. But as she prepared to leave their hiding place, an idea struck her, one so audacious that it took her breath away. Instead of running from Morrison's men, what if she used them to get to Phoenix? Her grandfather's journal contained detailed information about Morrison's operation, including the locations of supply depots, communication routes, and meeting points used by the conspiracy. If she could intercept their communications, she might be able to turn Morrison's own network against him. The nearest communication point was a way station 20 miles southeast of Fort Whipple, where Morrison's riders changed horses and passed messages between field operations and territorial headquarters. According to the journal, the station was lightly guarded and served as a hub for coordinating activities across Morrison's territory. "It's crazy enough to work," she told Ghost, as they began moving through the darkness. "They'll never expect us to attack their own supply line." The journey to the way station took them across terrain that tested both their endurance and their stealth skills. Morrison's search parties were everywhere, forcing them to travel in short bursts between hiding places, always staying one step ahead of discovery. Ghost proved invaluable during these tense passages, his senses detecting approaching riders long before Nali could hear them. His ability to move silently through the desert and his understanding of their mission made him the perfect partner for what was essentially a military operation. On the second night, they reached the ridge overlooking Morrison's way station. The facility was larger than Nali had expected. A main building with attached stables, a corral for fresh horses, and storage sheds for supplies. 3 men were visible around a campfire, and she could see light in the windows of the main building. Through her field glasses, she watched the station's routine for several hours. A rider arrived shortly after midnight, spent about an hour inside the main building, then departed with a fresh horse heading toward Phoenix. The pattern suggested regular courier runs, carrying messages between Morrison and his contacts in the territorial capital. "If we can intercept the next courier," she murmured to Ghost, "we might be able to get to Phoenix without anyone knowing we're coming." The plan that formed in her mind was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. She would have to get close enough to the station to overpower the next courier without alerting the guards, then use the stolen horse and documents to bluff. Her way into the territorial capital, Ghost seemed to understand the gravity of what they were planning. His behavior had become even more protective, and he stayed close to her side as they moved into position near the station's entrance. The wait lasted until the following evening, when another courier arrived from the direction of Copper Ridge. This rider was smaller than the previous one, about Nali's size, and wore dark clothing that would be perfect for night travel. As the courier prepared to leave the station with fresh dispatches, Nali put her plan into action. She and Ghost positioned themselves along the dark trail leading away from the station, where the courier would pass within arm's reach of their hiding place. The ambush went exactly as planned. Ghost's sudden appearance spooked the courier's horse, causing it to rear and throw its rider. Before the man could recover, Nali had his pistol and was ordering him to stay quiet. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, though her hands shook as she held the weapon. "We just need your horse and your dispatches." The courier, a young man barely older than a teenager, stared at her in disbelief. "You're just a kid who's already killed one of Morrison's men," she lied convincingly. "Don't make me add you to the list." The bluff worked. The courier handed over his saddlebags and dispatch case without further resistance, then watched in amazement as Nali mounted his horse with the practiced ease of someone raised in Apache traditions. "Tell Morrison that Samuel Crawford's granddaughter sends her regards," she said as she rode away, Ghost loping easily beside the horse. The stolen dispatches proved to be a treasure trove of information about Morrison's current operations. 1. Message detailed plans to eliminate the remaining Apache scouts who might testify against the conspiracy. Another contained a list of federal officials in Phoenix who were considered reliable supporters of territorial expansion policies. Most valuable was a letter from Morrison to the territorial governor, outlining a timeline for completing the Apache problem in the Copper Ridge area. The letter made it clear that the conspiracy planned to claim all remaining Apache lands within the next 6 months, using whatever methods proved necessary. But it was the final document that made Nali's blood run cold, a detailed plan for her own assassination, complete with instructions for making her death look like an accident caused by hostile Indians seeking revenge for federal interference. Morrison wasn't just trying to silence her. He was planning to use her murder as justification for a broader campaign against Apache families throughout the territory. "They're going to blame my death on our own people," she said aloud, the full scope of Morrison's evil becoming clear, "then use it as an excuse to kill everyone else." The realization filled her with a fury that burned away her remaining childhood. Fears. Morrison's conspiracy wasn't just about stealing land or getting rich. It was about the systematic destruction of her people, carried out under the cover of territorial law. As they rode through the night toward Phoenix, Nali felt the weight of her inheritance settling into its final form. She was no longer just carrying evidence of crimes. She was carrying the hopes of an entire people who faced extinction if Morrison's plan succeeded. Ghost ran beside her horse with tireless determination, his presence a constant reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. Her grandfather had chosen them both for this mission, understanding that sometimes justice required the partnership of human courage and animal loyalty. The lights of Phoenix appeared on the horizon just before dawn, the territorial capital spreading across the desert valley like a promise of civilization. But Nali knew that beneath its civilized appearance lay the same corruption and violence that had destroyed so many Apache families. The final confrontation was approaching, and everything would depend on whether an 8-year-old Apache girl and her faithful dog could convince one honest judge that justice was more important than territorial politics. As they approached the outskirts of Phoenix, Nali felt the presence of her ancestors riding beside her, her grandmother's wisdom, her grandfather's determination, and the spirits of all the Apache families who had died for their ancestral lands. Their voices seemed to whisper that the time for running was over. It was time to stand and fight for what was right, no matter the cost. Phoenix at dawn was a city caught between two worlds, the rough frontier settlement it had been and the territorial capital it was becoming. Adobe buildings mixed with frame construction, while the streets bustled with the energy of commerce and politics that would shape Arizona's future. Nali rode into the city wearing the stolen courier's clothes, her hair hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and her face darkened with trail dust. Ghost trotted beside her horse like any working dog accompanying his master, drawing no special attention from the early morning crowds. The territorial courthouse stood at the heart of the city, an imposing two-story building that represented federal authority in a land where such authority was often more theoretical than real. But Judge Harrison's chambers were located in that building, and with them, Nali's only hope of seeing justice done. Getting inside proved easier than expected. The courthouse opened early to accommodate the territory's busy legal calendar, and a dusty courier delivering urgent dispatches was exactly the kind of visitor the building's guards expected to see. "I've got emergency documents for Judge Harrison," Nali told the desk clerk, keeping her voice low and gruff. "Territorial matter that can't wait." The clerk, a bored-looking man with ink-stained fingers, barely glanced up from his paperwork. "Judge Harrison doesn't take visitors before 9 o'clock. You'll have to wait." "This is about the Apache situation near Copper Ridge," Nali said, using the terminology she'd seen in Morrison's dispatches. The territorial governor said it was urgent. The mention of the governor's authority changed the clerk's attitude immediately. "In that case, I'll see if the judge is available. Wait here." As the clerk disappeared into the building's interior, Nali felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything depended on the next few minutes, on whether Judge Harrison would listen to her story, and whether the evidence she carried would be enough to convince him. Ghost pressed against her leg, offering silent support as they waited in the courthouse's marble-floored lobby. Other early visitors moved through the space, lawyers carrying briefcases, territorial officials discussing policy, and citizens seeking justice from the federal system. None of them paid attention to a small courier and his dog, which was exactly what Nali had hoped for. "The judge will see you," the clerk announced upon his return. "Follow me." Judge Harrison's chambers reflected the character Nali's grandfather had described in his journal. Simple but dignified furnishings, law books lining the walls, and an American flag displayed prominently behind an oak desk. The judge himself was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of a lifetime spent making difficult decisions. "You have urgent business regarding the Apache situation?" he asked, looking up from the legal brief he'd been reviewing. Nali removed her hat, allowing her black hair to fall free around her shoulders. "Your Honor, my name is Nali Crawford. I'm here to report a conspiracy involving territorial officials and the systematic murder of Apache families." Judge Harrison's expression shifted from mild curiosity to sharp attention. "You're not a courier." "No, sir. I'm the granddaughter of Samuel Crawford, who was murdered for investigating crimes against my people." The judge studied her face intently, as if trying to read the truth in her features. "Samuel Crawford was reported to have died of natural causes. He was poisoned, Your Honor, and I have evidence that proves it, along with evidence of a conspiracy that reaches all the way to the territorial governor's office." Nali opened the dispatch case and began laying documents across Judge Harrison's desk: her grandfather's journal, the mining claims, the partnership agreements, and the stolen correspondence that detailed Morrison's current operations. These Documents prove that territorial officials have been using forged federal authorizations to steal Apache land, then selling mining rights to Eastern investors, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. When Apache families refused to leave their ancestral lands, they were murdered, and their deaths blamed on Indian raids or accidents. Judge Harrison examined the evidence with the careful attention of a man who understood its implications. His face grew increasingly grim as he read through her grandfather's detailed accounts of Morrison's crimes. "If these allegations are accurate," he said finally, "we're looking at systematic fraud, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder committed under color of territorial authority." "It's all true, Your Honor. And there's more. Morrison is planning to use my own death as justification for a broader campaign against Apache families throughout the territory." The judge looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Nali handed him Morrison's assassination plan, the document that had chilled her blood when she'd first read it. "They're going to kill me and make it look like hostile Indians seeking revenge. Then they'll use my death to justify removing all remaining Apache families from lands they want to claim." Judge Harrison read the document twice, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is monstrous. Who else knows about this evidence?" "Everyone who tried to help me is dead, Your Honor. Sheriff Hastings, Joseph Running Bear, and my grandfather's other allies. Morrison's people killed them, all to keep this quiet." The weight of that truth hung in the air between them. Nali was the sole surviving witness to a conspiracy that had already claimed multiple lives and threatened to claim many more. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I need you to issue arrest warrants for Morrison and his associates before they realize I've made it to Phoenix. Once they know where I am, they'll try to silence me permanently." Judge Harrison was already reaching for his pen. "Young lady, you've shown remarkable courage in bringing this evidence forward. I'm going to make sure that courage wasn't wasted." Judge Harrison's pen moved swiftly across the legal documents, each signature carrying the weight of federal authority that Morrison's territorial connections couldn't override. As he worked, he explained the process to Nali with the patient tone of a man who understood that justice meant nothing if people couldn't understand it. "These arrest warrants carry federal jurisdiction," he said, sealing each document with his official stamp. "That means territorial officials can't interfere with the investigation, and Morrison's local allies can't provide protection." "How long before the arrests happen?" Nali asked. "Federal marshals will begin making arrests within hours, but Morrison is smart enough to have contingency plans. Once word reaches him that federal warrants have been issued, he'll either run or try to eliminate the evidence and anyone who might testify against him." The implication was clear. Nali was still in mortal danger until Morrison and his associates were safely in federal custody. "I can provide protection," Judge Harrison continued, "but I need you to understand that this process may take weeks or even months to complete. Are you prepared for that?" Before Nali could answer, Ghost suddenly rose from his position by her chair and moved to the window overlooking the courthouse steps. His low growl warned them that something was wrong outside. Judge Harrison joined the dog at the window, and his face went pale at what he saw. "How did they find you so quickly?" Nali looked out to see Morrison himself dismounting from a lathered horse, accompanied by 6 armed men. They moved with the confident swagger of people who believed territorial authority trumped federal law. "He must have intercepted the courier I robbed," Nali said, understanding dawning in her mind. "Morrison knows I'm here." "That doesn't matter," Judge Harrison said firmly. "He can't touch you on federal property, and these arrest warrants give him no choice but to surrender to federal custody." But as they watched, Morrison and his men spread out around the courthouse entrance in a pattern that looked more like a siege than a legal proceeding. These weren't men planning to respect federal jurisdiction. They were men preparing for a fight. "Your Honor," Nali said quietly, "Morrison isn't going to surrender. He's going to try to take the courthouse by force." Judge Harrison's jaw tightened as he recognized the truth of her assessment. Then we'd better make sure he fails. The judge moved to his desk and pulled out a locked drawer, revealing a pistol that looked well-maintained and ready for use. 20 years on the frontier teaches a man to be prepared for situations that legal precedent doesn't cover. A commotion in the courthouse lobby announced that Morrison's confrontation with federal authority had begun. Loud voices carried up the stairs as territorial officials demanded access to Judge Harrison's chambers. "Federal warrants or not," came Morrison's voice, clear and threatening, "that girl has stolen territorial property and committed crimes against lawful officials. We're taking her into custody." "Like hell you are," Judge Harrison muttered, checking his pistol's load. Ghost had positioned himself between Nali and the door, his body tense and ready for action. The loyal dog understood that the final confrontation was at hand, and he was prepared to defend his young partner with his life. "Nali," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I want you to stay behind my desk and keep your head down. Whatever happens, don't let them take you alive, not because I don't trust the legal system, but because Morrison can't afford to let you testify." The sound of boots on the courthouse stairs grew louder, accompanied by the metallic clicks of weapons being readied for use. Morrison was bringing his territorial authority to bear against federal jurisdiction, and the outcome would determine whether justice or corruption ruled the Arizona territory. "Judge Harrison!" Morrison's voice boomed from the hallway outside the chambers. "Open this door and surrender the Apache girl, or we'll take her by force." "This is a federal courthouse, Morrison," Judge Harrison called back. "You have no authority here, and I have warrants for your arrest. Surrender yourself and your men to federal custody." Morrison's response was a gunshot that splintered the wooden doorframe. The sound echoed through the courthouse like a declaration of war between territorial and federal authority. Ghost's answering snarl was low and dangerous, the sound of a weapon preparing to strike. Nali drew her own pistol, her hand steadier than she'd expected, as she prepared to defend the evidence that had cost so many lives to gather. "Remember," Judge Harrison said, as the door shuddered under the impact of shoulders and boots, "you're not just fighting for your own life. You're fighting for every Apache family Morrison has murdered and every family he plans to murder in the future." The door burst open, and Morrison appeared in the doorway with a gun in his hand and murder in his eyes. But he wasn't facing a helpless child anymore. He was facing a young woman who had inherited not just gold and land, but the fierce determination of her Apache ancestors and the uncompromising justice of the federal system. The final battle for the soul of the Arizona territory was about to begin. 50 years later, Nali Crawford Mitchell sat in the shade of the monument that marked where her grandfather's cabin had once stood. The bronze plaque read, "In memory of Samuel Crawford and all those who died defending Apache rights to ancestral lands. Their sacrifice was not in vain." Ghost's great-great-grandson, a russet-colored dog named Spirit, lay at her feet with the same patient dignity that had characterized his ancestor. The bloodline had remained strong, as had the bond between the Crawford family and their canine guardians. The confrontation in Judge Harrison's chambers had lasted only minutes, but its consequences had shaped decades. Morrison's attempt to storm a federal courthouse had been his final mistake. Federal marshals had arrived just as the shooting began, and the territorial officials who survived found themselves facing treason charges along with murder and conspiracy. "Tell me again about the day Ghost saved your life," said Maria, Nali's 12-year-old great-granddaughter, who had heard the story dozens of times but never tired of its telling. Nali smiled, her weathered hands resting on the walking stick carved from a piece of the original cabin's foundation. "Ghost didn't just save my life that day, child. He saved the lives of every Apache family Morrison planned to murder." The years had been kind to the land around Copper Ridge, where once there had been only desert scrub and hidden suffering. Now stood a thriving community that honored both Apache traditions and territorial progress. The gold from her grandfather's claims had funded the first integrated school in the Arizona Territory, where Apache and Anglo children learned together about justice, history, and the importance of standing up for what was right. "But how did you know to trust Judge Harrison?" Maria asked. "How did you know he wouldn't betray you like the others?" "Sometimes you have to choose trust over fear," Nali replied, the same answer her grandmother had given her so many years ago. "Your great-great-grandfather's journal taught me that not all white men were corrupt, just as not all Apache were hostile. The challenge was finding the ones who valued justice more than profit." Judge Harrison had become a lifelong friend and ally, eventually officiating at Nali's marriage to Thomas Crow Feather, the real Thomas Crow Feather, who had survived Morrison's attempt to eliminate Apache scouts and had testified at the trials that brought down the territorial conspiracy. "What happened to Morrison?" Maria asked, though she knew this part of the story by heart. "Morrison died in federal prison, along with most of his associates," Nali said. "The territorial governor was removed from office and spent his remaining years in disgrace. But more importantly, the legal precedents established by their trials made it much harder for future conspiracies to steal native land under color of law." The monument grounds included a small museum that displayed some of the evidence Nali and Ghost had risked their lives to preserve. Visitors came from across the country to see the documents that had exposed one of the most extensive land fraud conspiracies in American history. "Do you ever regret it?" Maria asked, "giving up a normal childhood to fight for justice?" Nali considered the question carefully, as she always did when young people asked about the choices that had shaped her life. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that adults failed so completely that children had to step forward to do what was right. But I don't regret the choice itself." Spirit raised his head and looked toward the horizon, where a dust cloud marked the approach of a vehicle. Nali recognized the official car of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, probably bringing more visitors who wanted to hear her story firsthand. "Why? Do they keep coming to ask about those days?" Maria wondered. "Because the struggle isn't over," Nali said. "There are still people who want to take what doesn't belong to them, still officials who can be corrupted, still communities that need protecting. My story isn't just about what happened 50 years ago. It's about what could happen tomorrow if people don't remain vigilant." The BIA car pulled up near the monument, and a young Native American woman emerged, carrying a briefcase and wearing the determined expression of someone on official business. "Mrs. Mitchell," the woman said, approaching with respectful formality. "I'm Sarah Crow Dog from the Bureau's Legal Division. We're investigating new evidence of mineral rights fraud in northern Arizona, and we were hoping you could help us understand the historical patterns." Nali smiled, recognizing in the young woman's bearing the same sense of purpose that had driven her own fight for justice decades earlier. "Of course, child. The fight for justice is always a partnership between generations." As they walked toward the museum, where the historical evidence was preserved, Spirit fell into step beside them with the patient dedication that marked his bloodline. The dog understood, as his ancestors had understood, that protecting the truth was a sacred responsibility that passed from one generation to the next. "Your great-great-grandfather would be proud," Nali told Maria as they followed the group. "He always said that the most precious inheritance wasn't gold or land, but the courage to stand up for what's right." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the monument grounds, highlighting the words carved into the bronze plaque. "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice achieved echoes through the generations." In the distance, the mountains that had witnessed so much suffering and sacrifice stood eternal and watchful, guardians of the truth that a young Apache girl and her faithful dog had risked everything to preserve. Their story had become legend, but more importantly, it had become a template for future generations who would face their own tests of courage and conscience. The land remembered everything, as it always had, and the spirits of those who had fought For justice continued to whisper their wisdom to anyone brave enough to listen.